Hello everyone, and welcome to the second part of the cardiovascular unit. We're going to be talking about the valvular heart disease, infective endocarditis, and then we're going to have a long, detailed talk about the most important, most common subject in cardiovascular system, which is heart failure. Let me start first with the valvular heart disease, and let me start with some important anatomical facts. Cardiac valves. What are the cardiac valves? We all know that the heart is made of 4 chambers, 2 atria on top and 2 ventricles. And it's made of kind of 2 halves. The right half, which receives the blood coming back from the body organs, and naturally this blood does not have enough oxygen because the body organs have extracted their needs of oxygen. And then the left half, which has the oxygenated blood, the red blood, because the blood has been oxygenated after visiting the lung. So the circulation goes this way. Blood returns from the body organs using the inferior vena cava and superior vena cava, and it goes right into the right atrium. And from the right atrium, it passes down to the right ventricle, and then the right ventricle is going to pump this deoxygenated blood to the lungs via the pulmonary artery. In the lungs, the blood is going to meet with oxygen and becomes oxygenated and returns back to the heart, now using the pulmonary veins, and the pulmonary veins will open into the left atrium, and from the left atrium the blood passes down to the left ventricle, which is going to pump the blood to all body organs via the aorta. So this is the direction of blood flow. Blood returns to the heart from the body organs via the inferior vena cava and superior vena cava. This enters the right side of the heart, this enters the right atrium, and from the right atrium, this deoxygenated blood passes down to the right ventricle, which pumps the blood via the pulmonary artery to the lungs, and in the lungs, this deoxygenated blood meets with oxygen, becomes saturated with oxygen, and returns back to the left side of the heart, to the left atrium, via the pulmonary veins, and from the left atrium it passes down to the left ventricle, which pumps this oxygenated blood to all body organs through the aorta. So blood should always move in this direction: right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary artery, back to the left atrium, left ventricle, aorta. What ensures this direction of the blood flow are structures in the heart called cardiac valves, And we have 4 main valves in the heart, and these are 2 atrioventricular valves, atrioventricular between the atrium and the ventricle on the right side and on the left side. On the left side we have the mitral valve, and it's a bicuspid valve, and on the right side we have the tricuspid valve. So they are between the upper chambers, which are the atria, and the lower chambers, which are the ventricles. And also we have 2 semilunar valves, and these are at the opening of the major vessels exiting the atria. We have the aortic valve at the opening of the aorta coming out of the left ventricle, and we have the pulmonary valves at the opening of the pulmonary artery coming out of the right ventricle. So don't forget, mitral valve and aortic valve are in the left side of the heart, whereas tricuspid valve and the pulmonary valve are in the right side of the heart. And what do we care more about? We always care more about the left side of the heart. Why? Because it is the left ventricle that pumps the blood to all body organs. So looking to this diagram, we can imagine what could go wrong if we have a valvular lesion. And the valvular lesion is going to be mainly one of 2 types. Either the valve is too tight and we call it stenosis, or the valve is kind of leaky and we call it regurgitation. So let's imagine, for example, we have mitral stenosis. Where is the mitral valve? It is the atrioventricular valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle. If this valve is a little bit stenotic, blood is going to have hard time passing from the left atrium to the left ventricle. So what's going to happen? 2 things. Number 1, a lot of blood will accumulate now in the left atrium because it cannot pass to the left ventricle, and consequently the left atrium is going to dilate, and consequently some of this blood is going to exert back pressure on the pulmonary circulation, and we're going to have pulmonary congestion. This is the first thing that's going to happen. The second thing that's going to happen is less blood is going to flow to the left ventricle because of this stenotic tight valve. And consequently, the left ventricle will not have enough blood to pump forward to the body organs. So what's going to happen? Some sort of tissue hypoperfusion, some sort of low or restricted cardiac output. Why? Because the left ventricle does not receive enough blood. Let's take, on the other hand, let's take mitral regurgitation. What's mitral regurgitation? The valve is leaky. So the valve is supposed to open when the left atrium contracts, pushing blood down to the left ventricle, and it is supposed to be tightly closed when the left ventricle starts contracting, so that blood is forced to flow only through the aortic valve into the aorta. But if the mitral valve is regurgitant, is not tightly closed during ventricular systole, so when the left ventricle contracts now, some of the blood is gonna return backward into the left atrium and some of the blood will go through the aorta. So what's gonna happen? In the next cardiac cycle, the left ventricle is gonna receive additional volume of blood. It's gonna receive the blood that it was originally gonna receive, in addition to the blood that regurgitates backward to the left atrium. This will result in dilated left ventricle. So in mitral regurgitation or in regurgitant lesions, we always have some sort of backflow, whereas in stenotic lesions, we have some sort of impeding the forward flow. We have auscultation positions for cardiac murmurs. What's cardiac murmurs? Whenever the blood flows through a diseased valve, the flow is going to be noisy because the flow is no longer going to be laminar flow. When the blood flows in layers, we call this laminar flow, and it is some sort of peaceful flow, and you cannot hear any abnormal sounds for this blood flow because it is laminar flow. But when the blood flows into a stenotic opening, a narrow opening, stenotic valve, or in mitral regurg, the blood is going to be flowing backward while some blood is flowing forward, and this is going to cause turbulence. Turbulent flow is always noisy, and because of this turbulent flow, when we listen by a stethoscope to a diseased valve, we are going to hear the noisy flow, the turbulent flow of the blood through the stenotic valves or the regurgitant valves, and we call it cardiac murmurs. So cardiac murmurs are the most important physical sign for a valvular lesion, and we have the famous auscultation areas, auscultation positions for aortic valve, pulmonary valve, tricuspid valve, and mitral valve. So I'm going to leave you with this diagram to review where exactly should we be listening to the cardiac murmurs.